help map complex relationships. And I think it's pretty obvious why this is useful in finance, because financial markets are very complex. And so I'm going to actually talk about some use cases in the next slide, but before that I think I should give a bit of background to those of you who are not familiar with deep learning, some of its inspirations, because it could help explain why it's actually good at making this mapping. So it takes loose inspiration from the biological brain, and I will stress loose inspiration, but the idea is that in the biological brain there's a school of thought that says memories are basically distributed representations. So by that it means that no individual neuron actually really contains a really complex piece of information, but rather they each do very simple calculations, and when you put all these simple calculations together, then you get something quite complex. And that's really what you're trying to do with an artificial neural network, in that it's layered, and each layer has an additional layer of complexity, right? And at its core, it's a very simple calculation. It's just a linear equation that's fed through a nonlinearity, okay? And so these hidden representations here, the typical example people use is with convolutional neural networks, which is not necessarily the same as this, but the same concept applies, such that you feed in the raw input, which is the pixels that you see in the image. It then goes to the first layer, which understands the very low level complexity, which is it identifies edges. And then the next layer then puts all these edges together and makes shapes. And then the next layer after that puts the shapes together to make something a bit more abstract, like eyes or mouth. And then you keep getting more and more complex the farther down, the farther deep that you go into the network. And that's sort of the idea, and we want to apply this to the financial markets. And one key thing that's a sort of, it's not really good to necessarily implement a vanilla neural network like this in the financial markets for most settings, because of the fact that history matters a lot in the markets, right? Like you can't just input the state of an environment at any point in time. What matters is the build-up up until that point. For example, if you're tracking GDP, like sure, today's GDP number is important, but how GDP has been changing over the past is also important. And so you can implement something called a recurrent neural network, which basically loops through the sequence and can help actually contextualize how things have been trending over the past. And so there are two efficient implementations, in case anyone's interested. That's long short-term memory and gated recurrent units, and more recently, attention mechanisms to do this very well. So now I'm going to actually dive into some of the use cases that you can apply to your own portfolios, and I've dabbled in a lot of these. I'll specifically tell you which ones I focus most on. But I'm going to start with the supervised learning context, which you're basically learning a mapping from inputs to outputs, such that the outputs actually have labels, and you're trying to minimize the error between your predictions and the labels. So the typical example can be if you're trying to predict returns sometime in the future, and so you can map your inputs to predict like equity returns or bond returns, or so have you, and you can trade off of that. What you can also do is you can form it into a classification problem and predict whether a market will go up or down. And you can actually extend this to multi-class classification, such that you can now predict like up, sideways, or down, or you can have like specific like quintiles or what have you. And you can actually apply the multiple output to regression as well, such that you can predict multiple asset returns. But the key thing there is that you want to make sure that all of your outputs share the same hidden representation, so that they should share the same set of inputs. Like you're not going to be trading like very different asset classes. They're probably all going to be like equity indices, for example. So that's supervised learning. Most people are probably familiar with that. So I'm going to jump now to reinforcement learning, which is one of my key areas of research. And with reinforcement learning, what you're doing is you're learning a mapping from states to actions. And states is kind of like the economic environment at any point in time. And your actions can be anything from buy, hold, sell, to actual portfolio allocations. And the objective in reinforcement learning is to maximize rewards over the long term. And there's a really cool thing that you don't actually need to specify an explicit window that you're trying to predict over. It's not like you specify I'm predicting over the next 20 days, but rather it just learns to maximize rewards over the long term, and you just set something like a discount factor. The discount returns back to the present value. And so this little pi sign over there, that's commonly used notation in reinforcement learning for a policy, which is the probability of taking a specific action in this state. Right? So you can imagine if your actions are buying equities or bonds, your policy will tell you what's the probability that I'm going to invest in equities or I'm going to invest in bonds. And as you train, it learns to assign a higher probability to the ones that will pay off the most in the current economic environment. Next, we can move on to Q values, which is also something that you learn in reinforcement learning. But rather than actually learning actions, what you're learning is the value of taking a particular action in a given state, right? So now, it's not necessarily what's the probability I'm going to invest in equities. It's rather, what's the expected value of investing in equities in this current environment? That's formally known as a Q network, which is the most popular topic in reinforcement learning. It's called Q learning. It's often best if you combine both approaches in actor-critic methods, but I'll sort of leave it to you to research further if you're interested. So now I'm going to move on to unsupervised learning, and I'm sorry for buzzing through this, there's just a time constraint. Feel free to ask questions afterwards if you're curious. So now with unsupervised learning, when people talk about deep learning and unsupervised learning, they're probably talking about some variant of an autoencoder. And what this is it has two parts. There's the encoder part, which performs dimensionality reduction in a nonlinear way until you get to the middle, which is the encoded vector. And then you have the decoded part, which you expand the dimensionality. And so the goal of this, which might sound silly, is to reconstruct the inputs. And I know that sounds silly, but it's actually quite elegant because as you reduce the number of dimensions in your data, you're losing information, right? And so the goal is to get rid of the noise and keep the signal. And in theory, if you're able to reconstruct the inputs well, then that middle encoded vector should contain a decent amount of signal and get rid of some of the noise. Now, obviously, there's a difference between theory and application, but you can make certain modifications to make this quite robust. And so what you can do then is you can just take out this middle part because it's in a low-dimensional space, and you can feed it in to another algorithm, like a supervised or reinforcement learning algorithm, and trade off of that. Another idea that you can use autoencoders for is to actually monitor the reconstruction error, right? Like if you build up a good model and it's able to reconstruct the inputs well, and you monitor this daily, the day that there's a huge reconstruction error, that might be an anomaly, and you might want to sort of dig deep and find out exactly what's going on. And so this is commonly known as anomaly detection. People actually use autoencoders for fraud detection. So in case anyone wants to sort of monitor something in their portfolio, this could be a good method to